Good evening. My name is Professor Keith Nugent. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research at Latrobe University. So first I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I'm delighted to be here to open tonight's Ideas in Society event, the final in what has been, I think, a truly remarkable year for the series. Unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond his control, the Vice-Chancellor of Latrobe University, Professor John Diehl, is not able to be here, but I'd like to welcome you all on his behalf. Now, under the leadership of Latrobe University's incomparable Vice-Chancellor's Fellow, Emeritus Professor Robert Mann, who's with us tonight, Ideas in Society continues to be one of the most thought-provoking and important forums that we have for a discussion of ideas. There's nothing else like it, quite like it, anywhere else in Australia. This year, the Ideas in Society program has investigated how we can create a better Australia, one which is more generous and more just, both at home and abroad. To name a few of the topics that we've covered this year, Gillian Triggs and Julian Burnside talked about ways that we can defend and extend human rights. Noel Pearson and Megan Davis considered relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Tim Flannery and Robin Eckersley gave us their thoughts on what could be done about climate change. And most recently, Jane Caro and Anne Mann situated the Me Too movement within a broader historical context by considering the precarious situation of older, single women. I'm sure you'll agree that these are some of the most pressing issues of our time, reflected upon by people who have earned the respect of their fellow Australians. And tonight's event, of course, is no exception. In the final event of the Ideas in Society, A Better Australia series, our discussants will be talking about something that is at the very heart of civil society, societal justice. While few of us would question the virtue of the concept of fair and just relations between individuals and society, reflected in wealth, opportunities and privileges being evenly distributed and accessible, we also know that the disparities in our society are only getting bigger. And while federal politicians out on the hustings over the next 8 months will all invoke the fabled Australian idea of the fair go, how does this notion actually play out in our modern economic system? In a neoliberal age, it's inevitable that there will be winners and losers, haves and have-nots, and as a laissez-faire market reaches its supposed equilibrium. Was Milton Friedman right in popularising the phrase, "there's no such thing as a free lunch"? Or should we look further back to the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who famously observed, "In the long run, we're all dead"? That's undeniably true. In other words, if left to its own devices, the economy might reach balance, but only if we're prepared to wait long enough. That, I think, is a questionable concept. And in any case, do we even live in a neoliberal age anymore? Or is neoliberalism losing its grip? And how does all of this matter for social justice? So, that's the topics facing us tonight. Now, before I introduce tonight's panellists, unfortunately, I do have to advise that due to unforeseen circumstances, Cassandra Goldie will be unable to join us for tonight's discussion. Cassandra was caught in a whole series of delayed flights, so I think is still in Adelaide waiting to get here. So I do apologise for that, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to hear from Cassandra at a later event. But tonight we will hear from two people who have indeed thought very deeply about these issues and have done an enormous amount of practical work to make a difference. First, may I introduce Father Frank Brennan. He's a Jesuit priest and CEO of Catholic Social Services Australia. He is a professor at the PM Glynn Institute at the Australian Catholic University and a research professor at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. He has chaired and participated in several important federal government reviews and is also a prolific author. His latest books are No Small Change, The Road to Recognition for Indigenous Australia, and the collection of essays amplifying that still small voice. Frank has received numerous tributes for his work, including being made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 1995 for services to Aboriginal Australians. So Please join me in welcoming Father Brennan. We're also thrilled that he will be joined by Latrobe alumna and a recipient of a Latrobe University Distinguished Alumni Award and an honorary doctorate, Connie Lenneberg. Connie is Executive Director of the Brotherhood of St Lawrence and a regular to the Ideas and Society Forum. And those of you who have been at some of these may recall that Connie joined Tim Costello earlier this year at an Ideas and Society event to consider Australia's international obligations. Now, Frank and Connie will talk for about 60 minutes, and then we'll have time for some Q&A with the audience. So, for now, I will leave you in their very capable hands to discuss social justice in a neoliberal age. Please join me in welcoming them both once again.
Well, it's a huge topic we've got to think about tonight and talk about, and I'm really struck that we are having a conversation about whether Australia is still the land of the fair go when we're 27 years into continuous economic growth, an unemployment rate that ostensibly is almost at full employment, and in some senses a country that's recognised globally as being one of the most the richest countries in the world. I think we've actually just been found by Credit Suisse to have the richest people in the world. And yet you and I know that disguises a very different picture of 1 in 8 Australians living in poverty, of levels of Indigenous disadvantage that are shameful for our country, and increasingly hearing stories of food insecurity and of just recently I heard from the ACOS study with the University of New South Wales that some 50,000 Australians live on less than that global poverty line of $1 a day. It's extraordinary.
Well, the challenges, as you say, Connie, are great, and might I begin first in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. And we know that any time we discuss these statistics or these realities, they impinge most on First Australians,
Yes.
which after 230 years is a national disgrace. I feel I should also start with an apology because I came along to be second fiddle to Cassandra as you were going to interview both of us this evening. So I know there'll be a considerable number of you who are very disappointed that Cassandra is not here. And I think that in Cassandra and in ACOS, we see that relentless advocacy which is required when we contemplate that after 27 years of economic growth, that the perception, particularly of young Australians, is that it's tougher than ever. Yeah. And in terms of the equality of opportunity in relation to health, in relation to education, and in relation to housing, 3 of the key indicators, that it is seen to be more difficult all of the time. And therefore, there is the increasing perception that it depends on our postcode or it depends on our parents. And we as a nation never thought it would come to that.
And it's not just perception. I mean, I was quite struck at a recent study that showed that for children from more disadvantaged postcodes, more disadvantaged areas, by the time they take the second NAPLAN test, so 13, 14 years old, they're on average 4 years behind children who are taking that test for basic literacy and numeracy and problem-solving skills in wealthier postcodes. So it's not a perception, it's a reality that increasingly we see poverty entrenched in particular geographic locations, and that makes that downward spiral quite alarming. But it also means that some of us can look away if we don't go to those places and we're not aware of where they are.
Yes, well, I'm no economist, but I've always been guided by that great salvo, Ross Gittins, and you might have seen he was writing only this morning about some recent OECD report that finds that the situation of educational disadvantage has actually increased in Australia over the last decade, and that we are now rating very poorly in the OECD in terms of the number of disadvantaged students who are in disadvantaged schools. And We've been through the complex debate about all of the Gonski issues, and we are still a long way from finding a resolution of that where we can provide a quality of educational opportunity.
So do you think that's inevitable, Frank, that the fact that we've gone down a path of the free market and of individual opportunity, do you think the growth that we've experienced, this economic prosperity for some, necessarily means that there are people who are left behind and who are disadvantaged, or do you see that there are other options, other paths that we might have taken?
I don't think it's inevitable, but I think over these 27 years we've wasted a lot of opportunities, and I think we are at a critical stage as a society at the moment in that, I mean, it's not only the US with Trump, it's not only Brexit, it's not only us with a repetition of number of prime ministers. I mean, look at what we've had of late with Royal Commissions, loss of trust in institutions, including churches, particularly my own church, lack of trust now in financial institutions, and a considerable loss of trust in major political parties. And I think this is the case particularly for the young. And I mean, what was it about major political parties that helped was that I think you could presume that with a major political party there could be some shared value philosophical base which would allow an atmosphere of trust where there could be the resolution of conflicting claims and where there might be a possibility of espousing policies for what I would call the common good and not simply those of sectional interests. And so I think what we're seeing at the moment is with the decline of trust in major institutions, then how do we find the means by which the necessary compromises can be effected, where people can own these sorts of outcomes? My own experience over the years with Aboriginal communities, I've often tried to take the test where I say to myself, look, I come from a very privileged white background, but for Aboriginal people I try to imagine what would be the circumstances where the Aboriginal kid comes home from school, says they've had a tough day in the playground or whatever, but where the parents say, get back in there because they give us a fair go. And we are a long way from that now in terms of the institutions which can provide the wherewithal for that response.
Isn't part of that, though, I don't disagree with that, but part of it is also what the broader community is saying. So, you know, with some of the work that the Brotherhood's done around raising issues of disadvantage within communities, you know, the combined campaign we all are pursuing around the desperate need to increase New Start because it's a hunger benefit, if we can use that name. It's a hunger allowance, not a participation allowance. It's a barrier. And we all agree, the Business Council of Australia agrees, economists agree. And
Business Council agreed 5 years ago.
Yeah, and we have this loud voice as institutions, but what we haven't been able to do is motivate the broad Australian community to stand up. So the response that we've got from certain sections, from political leaders, is there's no votes in it.
Well,
so,
I think the New Start case is a very good example on a number of fronts. So what are we looking at? We're looking at a payment at the moment which, I mean, for a single person, about $275 a week. If they're on a pension, they'll be on over $400 a week. And then if they're on a very basic wage, it'll be $750, $800 a week. Now, the first question, it always seems to me, and maybe it's the lawyer in me, Connie, but I say that where neoliberalism does us a disservice is we as a society have said, well, look, people are on welfare. We can wait until we get back to a situation of budget surplus where our politicians will then decide out of the goodness of their hearts, yes, we'll throw something their way. Now, we as a society say, well, in relation to things like the basic minimum wage, that's not good enough. We have a transparent process, we have a structure which is there which applies principles. So why can't we do that in terms of welfare payments? If we have a Fair Work Commission, why isn't there that sort of structure in place where you can then address the principles? Now, some will say, oh no, well, there are no clear principles to apply. But if you look back, Ken Henry's taxation review back there at the time when Swan was the Treasurer. I mean, I think he very accurately indicated that there have got to be three separate sorts of payments. Your pension, you look at what is necessary for a dignified, frugal existence of people who you would not expect to be working in the community, and so you set your pension. Then, when you come to something like your New Start allowance, you say, well, we've got to use carrot and sticks. There have got to be some incentives for people to access training and employment, and so you factor that in. And then thirdly, when you're looking at something like student allowances, you say, well, of course, you can expect that students will take out loans so that over time, with a better education, they'll get better employment prospects in the future, and that they will have the possibility of being able to work part-time, and that is something which is also quite respectful of their dignity. Now, why can't we set up a process where we've got that three-tiered approach and then have a truly independent commission to do that, rather than it being said in every election cycle, well, we might get around to it. And let's face it, the best the Labor Party's been able to do is say, we'll have a look at it. Now, I actually know from experience what it means when the Labor Party says we'll have a look at it. A parallel from my own experience was the Labor Party used to have a commitment to legislate a National Human Rights Act. But then the lobbyists got to work, and so at a national conference, Labor amended its policy from a commitment to having a Human Rights Act to saying we'll have a consultation about it. Now, I happen to be appointed to chair that consultation. But we were left in a situation where we knew there was no prospect of the Labor Party delivering on any sort of commitment. And so once again, simply to say you'll have a consultation about it is inadequate, but this brings us back to the situation when your major political parties are dilly-dallying on this. With all respect, it is in the end no answer to simply say, well, let's vote Green and then we'll deliver the welfare agenda. Yes, when Greens are in government and control the Senate, we will deliver on the welfare agenda. But, you know, you've got to have almost a religious belief in the Perusia for that to come about.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, you know, you said, why is it? And this is a question that I find really bewildering. You know, I've come back to Australia after living the past 7 years in the Middle East and working on international humanitarian issues. And so to some extent you come back and, you know, I've come back for family, for Christmas. You don't really engage. So I've been quite struck by how hard this conversation's become and how alliances of different sectors, business with the welfare sector, is not getting any cut through. In, you know, you have consulting firms having done analysis that demonstrates the economic benefit of increasing an allowance like New Start and how that will flow into local communities and generate positive benefit for the community as a whole. And yet we're not getting any traction. And that language of the problems that we have and the problems that people suffer living in disadvantage is somehow their fault. And what we need to change or adapt is their skill level, their behaviour, most importantly, their attitude. So it's all about them. And really, from the Brotherhood of St Lawrence's point of view, our work is showing how much that really casts into a shadow the real policy drivers of poverty, which are all about wages not increasing, about social security welfare payments being woefully inadequate. It's about the way the nature of work is changing, so that, you know, people are not sure, even if they've got a job, how many hours of work they will actually get next week, or whether those hours will be at a time when the childcare centre's open, so they can actually accept those hours. That you know, the rising cost of living, which everyone has experienced, we know, is experienced by the poor, the poorer members of our community so much more. I think a recent rental affordability index showed that if you're a single person on New Start, it was on one particular weekend, there was not one single rental accommodation on the market that you could afford in Canberra, Sydney or Melbourne. So, it's not about the individual when it gets to that point. How do we shift that narrative and how do we get that broad-based public support? I mean, we've got it. People here tonight and in many other forums are wanting to discuss what does a fair go mean? What is the better Australia? And how do we get there? But obviously there's a lot that are not engaging in that conversation.
Well, where we live in a society where, you've got basically a pretty static 5 to 5.7% unemployment rate, and government, of both persuasions, rightly says, well, look, our welfare bill is too high, we want to be able to cut it. But then what is the first recourse? Rather than those major economic levers to which you have referred, the knee-jerk reaction we've developed as a society is basically to demonise those who are unemployed. Yeah. Or we say that they simply lack the motivation to go out and find that job. So what we then do is we say, right, let's experiment with something like what they call a cashless debit card. Now, what do we do typically as a society? We say we'll experiment with that in, let's say, 2 places. And where do we pick? We pick Ceduna in rural South Australia and the Kimberley in Western Australia. Now, who lives in those places? Surprise, surprise. There's a disproportionate Aboriginal population in those places. Is there prospect of employment? No. Is there prospect of job training? Absolutely not. But it said, let's get this tried, where what we will do is we'll provide wraparound services because this will provide access to work. And we think it will be enhancing the dignity of these people and it will be creating a greater sense of self-determination. But what do you do over time with such a trial? With some individuals, that might be the case, but the real risk you run is that you simply compound the sense of powerlessness and alienation, where people are being told, there's no prospect of you ever having a job, but guess what? While you don't have a job, we're now going to tailor what you can do. We are going to reduce the scope of your free choices because we think it's your reckless exercise of free choice which results in you not having employment possibilities, when in fact it's nothing of the sort.
Yeah, exactly.
And so what is necessary is to be able to work with those communities to truly have a situation. Why isn't it designed where, right, instead of it being universally applied, you say, well, we've got the resources at hand, we will apply this as a punitive measure for people who have been before the courts or who are in domestic situations which are unacceptable. But what we do instead is we universalise it and then we demonise people and we demean them. And I think that's unacceptable.
It is unacceptable. It's talking about what's unacceptable in the system. It has so many dimensions. I was just recently aware for job seekers, this requirement that you demonstrate that you're actively seeking work, that you meet the requirement of putting in so and so many job applications. And I was listening to something from some young men in Burney where we know there's also not a lot of opportunities for employment. They were young men who'd got into a bit of trouble in their teenage years. They were just, I think one was 19, one was 20. And they spoke about the challenges of having to go through these hoops, which on a weekly basis further diminish them. You're putting in applications for jobs that you're not qualified for. You're not even going to get the courtesy of an answer. You're on this little cycle and you're continually feeling more invisible, not being able to meet the requirements. And somebody asked, the journalist asked these young men, so what situation do you now find yourself in? And they said, we're nothing and nowhere. And you think, what a impossible situation for, bright young men to feel at that point in their lives that they have no future and really see no way for themselves into being seen and being able to contribute and being able to have the dignity of making their own choices about their lives and seeing a future.
I think another part of it is that increasingly we're part of a society where there's almost a sense of a hollowing out of the middle class, and there's a sense that even for those who do have employment, it's getting tougher. I mean, look, for example, at the statistics of young people and home ownership, for example. It's plummeted significantly. Now, you know, you've got some initiatives, the Labor Party, for example, suggesting that they'll do something about negative gearing, where it will only be available in relation to, you know, those which are not major investment properties and things of that sort, or the discounting of the capital gains tax benefit. Those sorts of things, I mean, are they worth a try? I mean, I'm not an economist, I don't know the answer. We've got the Murdoch press running a strong campaign against it at the moment. But I think what is incontrovertible is that young people who in the past would have been readily seeing themselves as part of the middle class, that is now just not an option for them. So they see themselves doing it tough. So the chances for them to be having an eye for those that we've been talking about reduces considerably.
There's that pervading sense of unease, isn't there, and fear that even if you're okay today, you may not be, and there are some reasons for that. But yet, we have had 27 years of economic growth. And I think what we're saying is, well, if that's the core of the neoliberal model, it's not working for an important part of our community. So what do we do? What would we do if we had the levers and did have the political influence? What changes in policy do we actually need?
Well, we Australians, I mean, we'll make a virtue of necessity, and that's when it will impact on us.
Yeah.
And I think we're in a situation now where we know that those days are not going to last. We know people are living longer. We also know that employment possibilities for people are reducing, particularly with the developments in technology which are occurring. So these are the huge challenges which are ahead of us, which then give rise to the question, how do we get back to a sense of what is the common good and a concern for the neighbour and not just those of the group?
Yes.
Because what I'm suggesting is not only with the decline of trust in major institutions, but with a more atomized and tribalised sense of identity which is developing, then what we've had is a fraying of the welfare net, and we've had a fraying of the sense that if you are an Australian, that there are things which are accorded to you, such as we haven't done. I mean, we haven't gone down the past in the American path. I mean, one of my favourite lines is when Paul Keating once said, you know, when island nation continents were being given out, there weren't many of them, and we were very blessed we got one to ourselves. Now, part our approach as Australians was to say, if you're here, then you are entitled to what is necessary for maintaining your human dignity. There was no sense of second-class citizenship in terms of below-award wages for those who are not citizens, and there was no sense that people on different sorts of visas would be disadvantaged in particular ways. Now, in part because, and I pay tribute to someone like Robert Mann here tonight, who's fought tirelessly on this to try and overcome this isolationist sense that we have built up now in Australia, where we have become so punitive towards individuals, including those who are waiting in the Australian community for the processing of their refugee claims, where we have withdrawn from them the possibility of meaningful employment and dignified welfare assistance, where it's to be said that they're just to be dependent on the community generally, the non-government sector, or presumably they are to engage in activity which is not warranted by the law. And I think that is causing a lot of damage to the social fabric of our society, not just to them.
Yes, absolutely. I think there are beacons of hope out there, though. We at the Brotherhood celebrated just recently with the ANZ Bank a milestone for a program called Given the Chance. So I'm very encouraged that a large bank will see and get themselves involved in a program which is about giving refugees and asylum seekers specifically the opportunity to have the experience of work in Australia. And so it's a program which is a very intensive program designed to help refugees and asylum seekers gain that critical first step of work experience and then get their jobs. And we found that once they do their 6-month work experience, over 80% of those people have actually been taken on to permanent employment. So it's a great example of how when business opens itself up to the talents and gifts that the diversity that comes with asylum seekers and refugees as one group that's excluded, are given that opportunity, what a boon it is for business, frankly, quite apart from, feeling that we're better people for having provided that opportunity. So.
And I do think that, given the secularisation of our society that's occurred, therefore adherence to churches or religious belief in terms of being the motivation for people in that area has subsided considerably. And given the lack of trust now in government and major political parties, then corporations, businesses, but also your NGOs, like whether it's Amnesty or Oxfam or whatever, I think that capacity, particularly for younger Australians, to say that actually we can work and network together without having to buy the whole philosophical package, whether it be of the Liberal Party, the Labor Party, the Catholic Church or whatever, but that we can be in a situation where we can see that we do have social responsibilities which go beyond simply that of my own group and simply that of individual activity. And it's through this, corporate responsibility, but also of these large NGOs, that I think we're finding an expression, if you like, of the new social morality, which is the new way of motivating towards social justice.
I think there's real hope in that when you speak to young people, they're saying that we want our lives as a whole to be having a positive social impact. And I think that's often not understood. We can be very disparaging of young people and their obsession with social media and things like that. And I think they can sometimes get a bad rap about being superficial, but some research has shown they're actually very socially aware, very concerned about the environment, very concerned about society. And it's those concerns which are leading to changes in larger institutions. And hopefully that expresses itself eventually into the political space, and we start to see, greater leadership on these longer-term social issues that are part of what we believe ourselves to be as Australians when we talk about a fair go.
I think another aspect of it, and I'd be interested in your research of the Brotherhood on this. If you take a case study like the NDIS. Now, I think everyone would say the NDIS is a wonderful idea. Why? Because it focuses upon the individual being able to make informed choices, and there is full respect for the dignity of the individual. It becomes a person-centred program. But very quickly, it can become simply a business model. And now, where in the past, the way in which, through the service of the common good, the way in which we were able to look out for those who are most marginalised and most vulnerable was by making block grants to major institutions, whether they were churches or not-for-profits or whatever. That is now being transformed into a new model of saying, well, we bring in the for-profit providers and we let the market decide so that the person is in a position as client to decide how that service will be delivered. Now, the difficult area we're in at the moment is that government has set up the template for that. We don't yet have the market being able to work so that we have a sufficient number of providers which are working well. There's been collapse of some of those who used to receive the block grants, and the people who are missing out are those who are the most marginal and those who really are the most vulnerable.
The Brotherhood's actually involved in local area coordination and also in the early childhood space, and one of our great concerns is precisely this great social innovation, this great social policy, but being rolled out very, very quickly so that you can run over the objectives of being person-centred and being really focused on providing the best possible plan and opportunity for each individual that is a client there, but most concerned about the market, you know, and I think it really is this ideological space of saying the market will sort it out, but there's an awful lot of people who fall through the cracks while the market is gearing up, and then there's the concern about the quality of the services. So, you know, if we talk perhaps a little bit about regional Australia, if you look at the NDIS and the opportunities there, the market is even more undeveloped, as we've seen, you know, the major centres be a magnet for people and services and businesses and what have you. So it's a great idea, but it really speaks to the role, a different role for government in terms of ensuring, as you said, that as Australians we might have rights in relation to clear rights and expectations in relation to government that would require a different role for government as we go forward if we are going to play with these kinds of ideas.
Particularly in regional Australia. I mean, last year I remember going out to Sejuna in outback South Australia, and we had our Catholic care there. They had been service providers. The NDIS was coming in, and they were told that, well, for these Aboriginal youths with psychiatric needs, the first thing you'll have to do is bring in a psychiatrist to do a psychiatric assessment. Well, where was the money going to come from for that? I mean, it was just not there. There's no plan for it. And so particularly when you get into regional Australia, then the ideas that look very good in healthy marketplaces in metropolitan areas, it just doesn't carry. And so you do need some sort of block funding mechanism as a fallback, as a default.
So we're sort of saying what needs to change to take us to that fairer Australia, and we're saying you need to fund the community sector differently. That's a little bit self-serving, I feel, in saying that, but we do.
I think we can be unapologetic about that.
Absolutely. You know, if the market isn't there, and certainly the submissions to the recent Senate inquiry around that unanimously made that case, the market just simply isn't developed, and there are real people who are waiting for services and can't afford to wait for goodness knows how long till the market is mature. And also I think, you know, we're saying that we need to have not only a different political leadership, but as a community we need to mature our conversations around, you know, a better Australia. What does that look like, and how do we drive that? I'm really interested in your views around our First Nations people and, you know, with the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Do you see that as something that can be more proactively pursued as a way to start a different kind of discourse about what might be a socially just solution for this disadvantage that has been intractable?
Well, I think what can be proactively pursued is to be in touch with what is it that's actually being sought with something like the Uluru Statement. And basically, as I hear it, it's Indigenous Australians saying to the rest of us, look, unless we've got a place at the table, then it's good money after bad, and it's you white fellas saying what you think is in our best interests. We know we've got dreadful problems to deal with, particularly in remote Australia, but they're our problems, and we need to be full partners in terms of dealing with that. Now, trying to then move beyond that, and we've got a parliamentary committee dealing with it at the moment. I appeared before them the other day. Yes, what you've got at the moment is the Indigenous leadership out of Uluru saying we want a question which is to be put by way of referendum to the Australian people as soon as possible. Now, I'm one Australian, though clearly not Indigenous, but I think that would be a serious mistake at this stage, basically because of the state of our politics. We have had only 8 successful referenda in Australian history, and anyone who tried to move around Parliament House, as it is at the moment, with the toxic atmosphere in that place, and thought that you would be able to get both sides to the table and agree on anything, you'd have rocks in your head. And so, given that this idea was ruled out completely by Tony Abbott when he was Prime Minister, it was then ruled out by Turnbull when he was Prime Minister, and he did it with Brandis and Scullion at his side, saying it'll be a third chamber, which I think is nonsense, with all respect to Mr Turnbull. But then Morrison as Prime Minister within the first couple of weeks, echoing that, then the prospect of having that put as a referendum question at this stage, I think is zilch. The other big question, and it is the challenge there for Indigenous Australia at the moment, is that over time, I think all governments have conceded that there is, of course, a need to have Aboriginal Australians at the table. We tried it in the 70s with a thing called the NACC. It was then replaced by the NAC, was then replaced by ATSIC, and most recently replaced by the Congress of Australia's First Peoples. Now, as I often say, I think probably the most successful model was ATSIC. I mean, I know it had its critics, but it was successful precisely in this regard, that it was a pyramid arrangement where you had locally elected councils, you then had elected regional councils, and you then had a national commission, which was half elected, half nominated. The only thing that works with any credibility in Aboriginal Australia is that which is local, which feeds up to the national level. And you need something like that 3-tiered sort of arrangement. Now, when ATSIC was set up, the number of Australians who identified as Indigenous in the census was about 250,000. Now it's over 650,000. Now, that's not just all natural increase, and there's some very good news stories behind all this. Part of it is that increasingly, coming of age as a nation, I think this is one of the good signs for us in terms of talking about ideas in society, is that yes, more and more Australians now have the information and feel proud of the fact that they can claim an Indigenous heritage. But when you come to the question about an Indigenous voice, for 650,000 people, that now includes, I think, a pretty solid middle-class component, as I might call it, and those who are proud of their Indigenous heritage. But then you've still got the people in the remote communities whose prospects of education and employment are almost non-existent. And so the voice question becomes very complex, even when you move beyond just the straight questions of constitutional design.
But as you say, there's you know, in the 7 years I was away, there's been a much different dialogue, the acknowledgement of country, the paying respects to elders, the confidence and the number of in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led organisations has been a massive change in a short period of time, which is, you know, something to really hang on to.
It's been one of the great changes. I remember 1993 when Paul Keating passed his Native Title Act through the Parliament. I was there. It was a wonderful occasion. But when I look back on it now with the eyes of 2018, I was privileged that night to be up in the public gallery of the Senate with a lot of the Aboriginal leaders who stood and applauded, and the all-white Senate chamber stood and applauded the Aboriginal leaders up in the gallery. It was a strict divide between black and white Australia. And now in our Parliament, that we have not just Indigenous representation, but, you know, you've got Indigenous representatives there who are outstanding politicians. People like Pat Dodson, Linda, Burney, Melon, Deary, Mccarthy, they're in there making a real difference in terms not only of the representation of their own mob, but in terms of representing the nation to itself. And I think that's a very welcome development.
It is. And, you know, as someone who's worked in international development, I find it quite bewildering that for some, the idea that you would have communities have their own representative mechanisms is somehow radical, or that they need to speak with one voice. The rest of us don't speak with one voice. You know, the women's movement is often sort of told you're speaking with too many voices. Well, we're very many people. And as you say, there are different issues depending on where you are in the social or economic hierarchy or system. That's going to change what your interests are. It doesn't mean that there aren't some overarching things that you can agree on. But, you know, if you look at international development practice, if you're trying to address communities, especially place-based communities of disadvantage, it is about investing in their voice and enabling them to organise locally and to ensure that if you're a decision maker, you spend the time listening. And I found it astounding that something like the Uluru Statement of the Heart can come out of such a profoundly comprehensive and inclusive process within community and be dismissed out of hand. So that's disappointing, and yet people continue to fight, and the grace of our Indigenous leaders in the way in which they continue to try and engage the rest of us, and particularly the political leaders in that, is a lesson for everyone, I think.
Turnbull's unilateral dismissal of it without meaningful consultation was not his finest hour.
No.
Could I ask you, in terms of your international experience then, on what you were just suggesting then, in the light of that, how do we address further the feminisation of poverty in Australia?
Well, I think it's very similar principles. It's about it's recognising that people know their own interests better than the rest of us who can presume to, and that we need to invest in listening to the lived experience of people who are living in poverty and marginalisation, and really respecting the roles that they have and the opportunities that they have. For women, I think I see many opportunities in the way the care sector has opened up in the economy as an opportunity for work. Yet it's almost as that's opening up, it's being simultaneously devalued because it's a mainly feminised workforce. You know, Brotherhood research is showing that amongst the most vulnerable to homelessness, it's not just Brotherhood research, broader research, women over 65 are particularly increasingly vulnerable to homelessness and poverty, that while women are playing a bigger role in our economy, they're increasingly in a very precarious situation with jobs that are paying piecemeal rates, the kind of jobs that, if we're making ethical decisions, we don't buy from suppliers that do that overseas, except we're entrenching that kind of practice in our own economy, which is extremely disturbing. So I think we've got a lot of work to do there. I do think the push for ensuring that women have a louder voice and that we recognise the value that they bring. Where would our economy and society be if the work that women did in care was actually gone? We would be in a parlous situation. So recognising the value to childcare, to in general the care professions, to elder care is really critical, and it's part of what's a fair go for those women. You know, one of the things I found, just when you're saying the international practice, is I think we spend a lot of time talking about women have equal human rights, and I believe that profoundly. But if I'm wanting to create a change, saying that doesn't actually help me, because then I've got to go on a personal, psychological discussion with every individual who doesn't believe that. And so I think what we learned internationally is that you have to make it much more instrumental. So I frankly don't care what a whole lot of people will think about whether women have equal rights or not. But if you want your project to be successful, if you want to get the outcomes that you're looking for, if you want these organisations and the corporate and the government sector to be less corrupt, well, there's actually World Bank data that tells you need more than 30% of women in your workforce. You need more than 30% of women in your leadership, and that shifts. If you want to change indicators around health and well-being of children, well, you've got to invest in the women, because that's the silver bullet that changes. You've got to invest in girls' education. So I think, for some of these issues that we've discussed, it's really doing our research and identifying what are those trigger points that will make a difference, and then pursuing them relentlessly in terms of the argument about what will bring the change that we say we're committed to.
Thank you. Well, shall we have some
Why don't we
questions
open
and
it up?
discussion?
Yes.
Yeah.
On that note, we've got 2 microphones roaming around the room, and so open up to questions.
You've mentioned it's unwise, impossible to proceed with a referendum on one issue. Almost as difficult is to get an Australian Charter of Human Rights. Just a suggestion that you might wish to comment on. In 1993, the Keating government brought in the Industrial Relations Reform Act, and one of its objects was ensuring that Australia's that Australia's labour standards meet international obligations. And at the end of that act was a whole raft of international, in fact, labour organisation conventions and so forth. So they were printed at the back of the Act. I'm wondering whether a similar approach in the Migration Act would have, it's a big ask, but it's not as big an ask as going straight from almost zero to a full Australian human rights charter. So I'll leave that seed thought with you and see what you think.
Right. Well, I'd separate out 2 things there. One, I mean, in terms of human rights generally, what often gets lost sight of in the public debate about human rights is that despite all the bad things we can say about us as Australians, we have been pretty good international citizens in one sense, that we have subscribed to most of the UN reporting provisions regarding the international instruments that we've signed up to. Now, I actually think one of the strong pragmatic reasons for having a National Human Rights Act is that at the end of the day, our Attorney General's Department has to spend a lot of time giving post facto explanations about how our legislation or practices do or do not comply with those international instruments and what's the justification for non-compliance. Well, I say you actually enhance parliamentary democracy by front-ending that and putting it at the beginning of the process, which is actually what a Human Rights Act does. The second thing is that one benefit of a Human Rights Act is that though the major critics of it have always said that it gives too much power to the judges, and you'll get that in the Murdoch press all of the time, what has to be admitted is this. In the past, our High Court of Australia, when confronted with a new issue, would ask themselves, well, what's the UK House of Lords said about this? Or what have the New Zealanders said? Or what have the Canadians said? Or whatever. When it now comes, like to a new piece of terrorism legislation or whatever, there's no point in our High Court asking that, because all other equivalent jurisdictions, their ultimate court of appeal, will simply have first port of call to their Human Rights Act. So basically, what we've done is we've isolated our High Court judges where they have to either invent it for themselves or basically come up with the same answers as those that use the human rights jurisprudence without admitting that that's what's going on. So over time, I think we as Australians will see the wisdom of joining the flow with something like a National Human Rights Act. Now, on migration, why I think that's different is the Convention on Refugees, as you're probably aware, does not have those sorts of reporting provisions in it. There's not a UN committee to which you have to give a regular report as to your compliance with the Convention. And that being the case, questions of national sovereignty will always be grasped by Australian governments, whether they're Liberal, Labor or Calathumpian. And that's why it is essential that the discussion that go on about the migration issues not be so much couched in terms of international human rights, but be couched in terms of day-to-day moral and pragmatic arguments. So what we've seen over the last couple of years, for example, with Australia maintaining the adverse conditions on Nauru and Manus Island, is the need for both sides of the debate to single out the two separate questions. One is stopping boats and turnbacks, particularly from Indonesia. The other is the adverse treatment of people in Nauru and Manus Island. Now, there is no causal connection between those two things, and both sides need to admit that. But what is necessary is, if you go back and look in 2012, the Angus Houston panel, which Julia Gillard set up, it was adamant. Angus Houston said, turnbacks have to be efficient, transparent and legal. He said at this time they're not, but maybe in the future they will be. Neither side of politics has done us, the citizens, the courtesy of telling us whether or not those conditions are fulfilled, and they need to be fulfilled. Now, what I'm saying is those sorts of discussions are not actually helped by much of the invoking of the language of international law, precisely because there's not the reporting provisions as with the Convention on Racial Discrimination, Sex Discrimination, etc. Yes, they do. They all do. And we as Australians, what we do generally, and as I say, we're as good almost as any country on this. We have the general reporting provisions, but then some of them have what's called an optional protocol, where an individual citizen who has exhausted all remedies can themselves go off and take Australia before the International Tribunal and have a determination made. Now, we've got to admit that often our governments don't take much notice, but it is a device which does have, I think, some ongoing educative moral effect. But you don't have that with the Refugee Convention.
Yeah, I wonder about how we can use some of those conventions better, because, for example, at the moment I'm aware that the Council for the Single Mum has got a case before a UN committee about the lack of support, income support and broader social support, a social safety net, before the UN committee. The question is then, when that's done, who else but the Guardian will be interested in reporting it? And it's like you have a great... the instrument is there, and it's really what you're saying about the moral weight. And I think the conversation that we're having is about a moral crisis in Australia. We have incredible economic wealth and prosperity, and we have desperate poverty, absolutely desperate poverty, entrenched in certain communities and locations. And I think that discussion of a Bill of Rights is, that's an instrument. I think we need that broader discussion of what can we expect as people in this country in terms of a base level of respect and support to allow us to live lives of dignity. And I think that conversation about rights is one important way, but it needs to be these bigger conversations with widening circles about, if we believe ourselves to be, as Australians, people who believe in the fair go, well, what do we do about this chasm that exists between where we are and where we believe ourselves to be?
And I'd make this point also, Connie, that why I think human rights are more and more important is that, particularly with increasing secularisation, where religious language, religious ideas don't cut it as they used to, and in a postmodern era where there's no unanimity of philosophical perspective, so there's no one philosophical approach which wins admiration and support. So what you get with international human rights discourse is at least a shared language of those from all diverse religious, philosophical, cultural traditions who say that here is a short list of what are the preconditions for according the human dignity of all persons, including those who are most vulnerable in that society. And you can say, well, it just sets up a lawyer's picnic. Well, the one thing about lawyers is that they have at least the capacity to engage in the argument, to take on board what might be the diverse philosophical, cultural perspectives. But in the end, you've got a language there and you've got a system which can set up what is a legitimate expectation as to what the state should do in honouring every person within that jurisdiction.
That's right, and I think within that framework there's also the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals about justice for people and planet, and that does also provide a global umbrella where every government, including ours, which has signed up to them, will be reporting on how it goes. And, you know, I think number 8 is decent work, which goes to, you know, the regulatory environment around our employment practices and about gender equity and around First Nations peoples and their opportunities. So there is quite a lot there that we can draw on.
Just on gender equity, could I say, I mean, I did bring some notes along tonight, which I haven't looked at, but the Australian Human Rights Commission, I mean, they reported a while ago, and this really shocked me. I mean, women comprise roughly 47% of all employees in Australia, paid an average $250 less than men each week. And the national pay gap is 15.3%, and it's remained between 15 and 19% for the past 2 decades. I mean, I thought I was living in Australia where at least over the last 2 decades this was improving, but it's not. And that women account for 68% of primary carers for older people and people with disability. And that in 2017, Australia was ranked 35th on a global index measuring gender equality, slipping from a high point of 15th in 2006. We've gone from 15th to 35th in terms of gender equality in just 10 years. I think that's a disgrace.
It's appalling, it is. And
I'm a white male cleric.
In terms of statistics of poverty, 40% of Australian children that live in single-parent households live in poverty, and we know that probably 90% of single-parent households are women-headed households. So poverty definitely has a woman's face in this country. Is that microphone going now? If you haven't forgotten your comment or question.
Nah, that's okay. Duncan Storer from the Australian Unemployed Workers Union and Victorian Kids in Care Advocacy Service. Okay, we have 116,000 people who are homeless, 733,000 children who are living in poverty, and 3 million people in Australia living in poverty. How do we make poverty an issue just as big as our power prices, water, make-believe crime in Melbourne and things like that? Or if I put my hat on of somebody who actually lives in Housing Commission in one of the poorest areas in Victoria, how do we get around to making the 5 big orgs that deal with charities spend some of their advertising dollar on putting signs on buses and things, on highways and things like that, demanding that the government deal with poverty, and we turn it into a major issue before the next election? We only have 6 months.
Connie.
I knew you were going to do that. Look, I think that is the $6 million question. You know, when you look at how the sector, how Australians from various walks of life have come together decrying the abysmal level of New Start, the way in which it diminishes, not dignifies individuals, the way it is a barrier to them finding employment, and the way it forces them into homelessness, into poverty, is remarkable that the political class have deaf ears to it. You know, when you have even the Business Council and conservative economists say this needs to change, this is economic, doesn't make economic sense, and when you have united voices across the community welfare sector, across religious organisations, saying that this is unfair and immoral. From my perspective, what we need is more people to come and demand that. You know, when people will say there's no votes in it, then the evidence and the voices, the compelling voices, are not actually getting the cut through. I'm not sure that spending money by putting posters on buses does it. I think people look away from things like that. I've been very encouraged by the campaign to get the kids off Nauru and how off Nauru, and how that's been a lever to get the bigger conversation about what is any refugee doing in these places, and that groundswell of community concern and conversation in the papers, in social media, to politicians is making a difference, and I think we can learn from that to keep pushing those issues.
I'd just add a couple of points. As you rightly pointed out, homelessness is getting worse. If we look at the figures of the recent census, back in 2011 it was 102,000. By 2016 it had blown out to 116,000. So when we thought we were making a concerted effort, we failed. Homelessness, of course, is always related in some way to affordable housing, and the shortage of community and social housing in Australia today. Australia needs more than 270,000 extra affordable homes for low-income households. So the social challenge is enormous. Now, I know we're not here to make party political points, but it is one part which I have thought, you know, all power to Chris Bowen going out there on a limb on what he's announced for Labor in terms of issues to do with the negative gearing and the capital gains announcements that he's made. We know that ownership rates for young people aged 25 to 34 have gone down in recent years from 60% to 48%. And so the idea that negative gearing would be available only for newly constructed houses, I think is a good idea. And I think there's a need to encourage more of these sorts of economic initiatives and to get some points of differentiation between the major political parties. As for putting signs on buses, I think even Mr. Morrison will find that there's not too much magic in putting signs on buses nowadays.
Yes.
Hi, so just want to state first, I studied at ACU political philosophy and I worked at the Brotherhood of St Lawrence in the early 2000s as a youth worker. I find it fascinating that you guys talk about how you're a bit disillusioned, it sounds to me, and probably most of us, that you're disillusioned with the major parties. And there's a bit of a, yeah, look, we're left and we lean left and we like what Labor say better, but we know they don't really address the issue. And I think going back to the last question is really interesting. I think there's a clear answer. There's no votes in fixing that problem. So if there's no votes in it for the major parties because they're not the broad spectrum of the voters and the populace, we need to put people in power, don't we, that will actually fix the problem. And then I come back to my actual question, which I apologise for rambling on, is I find it interesting that you guys have a lot of assumptions in what you're saying. I don't vote Greens, that's utopian, or I can't remember the particular comment you said. The Socialists, for example, are another party that want to fix these problems, and will, if you put them in power, they will make genuine attempts to do that. So I kind of wonder if even your amazing research and language is still couched in an economic framework that it's not going to fix the problem. Maybe we need to stop dismissing the utopianists or the Greens or whoever else, because if we don't start voting them into power, we're not going to change this. I would like to hear your responses. Thank you.
I welcome your remarks, and that's why I think it's necessary that universities have seminars like this, because what it's got to be about is moving the goalposts. I mean, if you want the politician to kick that way rather than this way, what you've got to do is move the goalposts, and that's what democracy is about. And yes, I fully accept that there would be presuppositions I have which you might want to blow out of the water. That's fine by me. provided we're on the same page about wanting to shift those goalposts so as to achieve greater good for the mass of the community, particularly those who are poor and vulnerable. And that the idea, for example, on something like the New Start allowance, that you would say, oh, well, these are the people who are poor and who are disempowered and voiceless, and therefore we would only address their needs for basic human dignity when we have returned the budget to surplus. We don't do that in relation to any other group. Why would we do it in relation to them? Now, in terms of your question about, yes, vote Green or vote for minor parties or whatever, I say that's fine, but particularly given the Australian political system, there is nothing worse, I think, than having a sort of very dissipated crossbench in the Senate where the prospects of getting coherent policy developed is very slight. And if I could give just one political example on that. I mean, what showed to me that Malcolm Turnbull had a tin ear was that he risked a double dissolution election over a couple of things that didn't really matter much, things which most of us wouldn't even remember now. And if you think back to someone who was a very wily politician, John Howard, and I was quite involved in this at the time during the Wick debate, you might remember Harradine had the balance of power in the Senate. It required a third Senate debate in the Senate. What happened was that in between the second and third debate, Pauline Hanson won 11 seats in the Queensland Parliament. It was the first time that she scored a political win. I remember Harradine ringing me the next day saying, I will now be able to cut a deal with Howard because there is no way he will risk a double dissolution election, because if there were a double dissolution election, Hanson would end up with the balance of power. And so then Harradine went in and cut the deal third time round, which Howard would not agree to second time round. Now, Turnbull had none of that political insight, and so we ended up with what we now have, a Senate where basically these sorts of issues become ungovernable. Finally, in terms of, yes, I respect those who vote Green or vote for any other minor party, but I suppose my point is to say that in terms of these fundamental social and economic questions, in the end, unless you're in there making a difference with the major political parties, you're just not going to cut it. But maybe that's a sign of my age.
If I respond, you know, I'm always acutely aware as someone who's worked like Frank as well in the community sector or my professional life, that you very quickly get marginalised and dismissed in conversations if you go to the bigger moral questions. You know, I've said earlier, I consider what we're seeing here in Australia right now a moral crisis when we have prosperity amidst such desperate poverty and a lack of hope that parts of our community experience because they see no way into being visible again within that economy and being able to find a way that they can contribute. Now, you can have that conversation, and I think, you know, the Ideas in Society Forum is one of the places where we do talk about values, and the whole point is around, you know, what is a better Australia, and what we hear increasingly in all kinds of circles is that people feel very uncomfortable, have a great sense of disquiet about where we are now and the things that we're saying. You know, if you look at the level of, you know, unemployment might be low, but we know for young people it's up at 13%. The level of underemployment is up at 18%. And there are so many people who've been pushed so far out that they're never going to find their way in. So you can have those conversations. And it's important that we do, because it is a question of who we are as a people. But I think we also have to look at how do we change in the current reality. And it is about putting up alternative political choices. It is about mobilising people to be aware of what's going on in their communities. And that's absolutely essential, that people are aware. And that's where the campaign to get kids off Nauru, I think, is a really positive one in terms of getting some real coalitions of people speaking with one voice about this is morally reprehensible, what we are doing as a nation to these very vulnerable people, and we want this to stop and change. And it's hard, but we're getting traction and we're seeing change, and I do think that's what we need to do more broadly.
Though, can I sound this warning note? It can't be just about the kids. No one wants the kids off Nauru any more than Peter Dutton does. I mean, he's keen to get the kids off, so we'll all forget about it. What we're dealing with is a humanitarian disaster of 2 residual caseloads. They will be particularly the single Iranian men on Manus Island who have been found not to be refugees, but we have crucified them over the last 5 years because a policy was developed that said, right, the only way Iran will take these people back is if they go voluntarily. How can we make them go voluntarily? We'll make their lives so miserable in Manus Island that they'll want to go back. Well, they've dug in with their resolve and their human spirit and said, we're not moving anywhere. Now, what are we going to do with that caseload? The second caseload will be those who have been found by Australia to be genuine refugees, but have not been accepted by the US, either because of heightened screening or different screening procedures. Now, what are we going to do in relation to them? Now, at the moment, the very difficult position we're all in is there is no way that the Labor Party wants a slither of light between themselves and Peter Dutton on how they're going to deal with those 2 residual caseloads. Because if there is, then it becomes an election issue which Dutton will ride mercilessly. And so that is why it is necessary that, yes, we can, if you like, pull the heartstrings regarding the children, and the treatment of the children, of course, has been absolutely despicable, but there is the hard work to be done. I think it probably won't be done until immediately after a change of government, and then it's got to be fixed and fixed quickly in our name, because in our name we have done dreadful things to these people for over 5 years.
Yeah. Are there further questions over to the left?
Hello, Margot Sheehan from Latrobe University. Thank you for the discussion to date. I'd like to shift the focus a little. We've been focusing on individual choice and the right to make your own choice, and the government's role in facilitating that. But it's the market I'm interested in, because the market is the provider of so many of these services which we might see as the claim that we as a right holder are making on society for basic food, shelter, etc. So I'm interested in, therefore, how the market can be held to account. And a lot of what we're saying about the government is actually the market, because it's the one delivering or not delivering the services. So we might have a little money in our pocket from the government through a welfare or whatever, but what we get with it is determined in large part by the market. And it's a little bit tricky to regulate it from a government point of view. And it's even more difficult for, say, delivery of services in remote areas, or even in just small towns, just regional centres, depending on the kind of service. If you're talking psychiatric services, it's very hard to get them outside of metropolitan areas. So I think I'd like to hear a little about how the market can be brought along in this story to help deliver, to meet the needs of poor, disadvantaged, etc., and not just the thriving middle class.
Well, as Paul Keating once said, always back self-interest, because at least you know it's trying, and that's one of the principal issues at play with the market. If we look at something like the NDIS as it's developing now, I mean, the thing is, we don't yet have a market. A place is being carved out for a market to operate. But what is essential is getting the mix right, and this is the role of government, it's the role of our elected representatives, is to determine that government will set the parameters of regulation within which that market might then operate so as to facilitate the individual choices of those who are customers or clients, while at the same time ensuring that there is an adequate safety net in place for those who cannot, simply by the exercise of personal choice in their own wallet and the government grant, assist and receive the service which is necessary. So that when you are creating a new system like that, what is necessary, and I presume this is the role of a body such as the NDIA, it is determining if and when to let the market take over, and if and when to set the parameters within which the regulation occurs.
Yeah, I'm a great believer in regulation because I think we've seen the way in which the market, when it's unfettered, deepens disadvantage and poverty. You know, we've seen it in the recent Banking Royal Commission. We've seen it. We see it in the NDIS because it's an underdeveloped market. And unless there are government incentives provided to shift the market into areas where they're not going to see the greatest self-interest, they're not going to go. And I do think, you know, our research with the Institute of Melbourne shows that the most entrenched long-term poverty is in urban regional areas. And, you know, we've all seen how so much has been sucked out of those places. You know, the banks are closing. They're lucky if the post office remains. You can't pay your bills in lots of country towns. So in terms of economic opportunity, there's not a lot going on outside of the fruit picking or, you know, the seasonal agricultural opportunities. So I think it's a real argument for saying that if we want vibrant communities, and we see them in other countries, you know, that you can be a really modern economy with vibrant regional communities, but it requires careful planning by government and incentivisation of the market to go and to serve those needs. And right now, it's all disincentives.
So you guys have been talking quite a bit about financial insecurity, especially among young Australians. And I'm just curious if you think that this is due to a lack of support or involvement from unions who traditionally fought for workers' rights.
I'm no expert in any of that, but I do think that the falling unionisation of our workforce, I think, is highly problematic. I remember many years ago, I mean, part of my family, I would say, are quite labour union oriented. And I remember, this is many years ago, I was at dinner at my sister's place and she had 5 children, and the oldest girl, I think, was at uni, and she said how she would never join a union. And her parents were horrified. She said, what do you mean you'd never join a union? She said, well, I work in 2 or 3 different part-time jobs, and I would actually be expected to join 2 or 3 separate unions, and none of them is actually interested in me. Now, I think given the casualisation of labour for a lot of young people, I think that's where a lot of the problems exist. Now, what the answer to that is, I don't know. That yes, if it were like the old days where, yes, you just, you know, went into that one job and there was one union that was there to look after you, then maybe things would be better.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree that, you know, collective action is really important to enable people to negotiate well with employers. And we know that in the gig economy, there really is no possibility for collective action, and it's actually running the other way. It's to the lowest common denominator and, you know, the cheapest that you can do, and you get paid on a piecemeal basis, which is stuff that we've said internationally we won't support, and yet we're seeing it more and more in our own economy. And certainly in the research that the Brotherhood's done, this is a really critical issue, and looking at how do we argue for the regulation of that workforce so that it does provide the basic minimum requirements to sustain a life. I think we're seeing now, I was reading something from the Food Bank the other day, that they're seeing more and more people who are in employment. I think it might have been 28% of the people who draw on food bank services are people who are actually in employment, but that employment is not providing them with a living wage. we know that people on New Start are overrepresented in terms of clients of homelessness services. These things are interconnected, and we certainly need to have a policy response that starts with a different perception of what people are entitled to expect as a social safety net in Australia, but also a much better regulation of the labour market, that the hard-won gains of previous generations are continued to be enjoyed now. Over to the left.
Hi, Chris Roach.
Time for one more question. Hi, Chris.
Hi. So, is there a danger that the narrative of saying Australia's very rich, but it's got a lot of very poor people, then plays into the kind of Hansonite argument that we can't give aid overseas because there's a lot of poor people here, and that we actually need a complete reframing of the argument around poverty and injustice, whereby domestic charities, international charities, aren't arguing separately for their case. They're arguing that it's a common problem. We have climate change, we have Indigenous rights, we have women's rights, and those things need to be fought together. And you're seeing youth groups doing this on climate change, on the Adani mine. You're seeing it on the West Papua issue. Is that conversation adequate enough between the domestic and international charities to actually reframe the debate quite fundamentally?
Yeah, it's a great question. I attended the first of the A Better Australia forums, and it was asking precisely that question. I think it's interesting that it circled back to very much the domestic case, and I agree strongly with you that, if you're going to be a society that recognises human rights, you have to recognise them both here and abroad. This issue of refugees that's so critical for us, the issue is not really in Australia. There are 67 million people that have been forced from their homes by violent conflict. And so there is the moral question of how we meet our international obligations that we've signed up to, and the common humanity that we afford people who've come to our shores. But really, if we care about the issue, we care about a better Australia in a better world. And I don't think you can separate those things at all. And that I think when you talk about the kind of Australia that you want to be and the kind of fair go that represents, you can't have that around national borders. I think Macron is very right with his statements this week that it's actually about a set of values which then inform humanity. And I actually have a lot of I hope that in Australia, in the domestic scene, we hear more conversations about the Sustainable Development Goals, because they really are a global compact. It started with the Millennium Development Goals, which was all about poor people somewhere else, to saying, actually, the Sustainable Development Goals are about our world collectively, justice for people and planet, and that we know it's inextricably bound up. You can't have a series of little lifeboats that can somehow insulate themselves from waves of injustice to humanity or to our climate. But I agree, we need to find forums to bring those discussions together and to advocate jointly.
We want a more equal society, and we want a nation that pulls its weight. And as a nation that pulls its weight, being a first world country which does have the benefit of geographic isolation, where we want to secure our borders, then part the dividend which we owe to the rest of the world is in pulling our weight to make that contribution, because otherwise there is no justification for maintaining the isolation and the economic privilege which is to be enjoyed in a country like Australia.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great point at which to stop this fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much, Connie. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Connie and Frank. I'd just like to say, I think on behalf of everybody here, that is a particularly fitting finish to the Ideas in Society program of Latrobe University. It's a deep issue that concerns us all, and clearly there's been passionate engagement around this topic with this audience. It's something that I think we all care very deeply about, and it's something that's of concern to us all and will be for a long time in the future, and we hope that we can make progress on that front. So with that in mind, I'll just ask you to once again join me in thanking Frank and Connie for sharing their insight and experience on this very important matter. So thank you to you both.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.